Whispers followed her like shadows, mocking the jagged, silver-burned flesh hidden beneath her heavy cloak. To the Silver Pine Pack, she was a deformed traitor, a broken omega meant to scrub their floors, but they forgot that even a ruined star can blind a king when dragged into the light. The cobblestones of Silver Pine Ridge were perpetually coated in a thin layer of mountain frost, but Lyra Hayes felt the cold deepest in her bones. She knelt by the grand fountain in the town square, a heavy, bristled brush in her raw, blistered hands, scrubbing away the moss that had gathered over the winter. Her posture was hunched, her shoulders curled inward, as if trying to shrink out of existence. Over her head, draped low enough to brush her collarbones, was a coarse, slate-gray woolen hood. It was a garment mandated by Alpha Dominic Reed, a garment meant to protect the delicate sensibilities of the pack from the horror that was Lyra's face. 3 years ago, Lyra had been the lead tracker of Silver Pine, a respected warrior with a sharp tactical mind and an unyielding loyalty to her people. She had been engaged to a promising pack enforcement officer named Liam, and her life had been a straight, predictable line of duty and honor. That was before the night of the autumn equinox, before a coordinated rogue attack breached the eastern perimeter, a sector Lyra had supposedly cleared just hours prior. The slaughter had been catastrophic. 16 pack members perished, including Dominic's younger sister. The pack demanded blood, and Beta Gregory, a man whose ambition was only outweighed by his cunning, found the perfect scapegoat. He produced forged documents and a tampered patrol log bearing Lyra's signature, framing her for selling the patrol routes to the rogues for a cache of pure gold and safe passage out of the territory. The evidence was entirely circumstantial, woven together with lies by Gregory and the pack's corrupt physician, Dr. Eris Blackwood, who testified that Lyra possessed wolfsbane in her quarters. No trial was held. Dominic, blinded by grief and a deep-seated insecurity regarding his own leadership, needed a public execution of justice, but death was deemed too merciful. Instead, Lyra was dragged to the center of the very square she now scrubbed, held down by 4 enforcers, and branded. They had used a silver branding iron, molded into the shape of a broken crescent, the universal symbol of a pack traitor. But Gregory had ensured the iron was dipped in a boiling tincture of liquid wolfsbane before it was pressed into the right side of Lyra's face. The searing agony had caused her wolf to retreat deep into the recesses of her mind, entering a state of dormant hibernation to survive the trauma. The burn melted through her cheek, trailing from her right temple down to her jawline, leaving behind a jagged, hypertrophic mass of discolored, ruined tissue that never truly stopped aching. Stripped of her rank, abandoned by Liam, who quickly mated another, and demoted to the lowest omega, Lyra became the pack's living cautionary tale. "Look at her, dragging that rag around like a drowned rat," a sharp voice echoed across the courtyard. Lyra didn't look up, but she recognized the sneering tone. It was Celine, Dominic's newly chosen mate, a woman whose beauty was a sharp contrast to her venomous spirit. Celine stood on the balcony of the Alpha's estate, flanked by 2 giggling attendants. "I still don't understand why Dominic keeps her alive," Celine continued, her voice intentionally loud enough to carry over the splashing fountain. "If I had a monster lurking in my territory, I'd have put it out of its misery. Honestly, the smell of her despair is ruining my morning tea." Lyra's jaw tightened, but she kept her head bowed, her vision restricted to the wet stones and her own shivering hands. Retaliation meant a week in the silver-lined isolation cells beneath the pack house. Survival meant silence. The town was in a state of chaotic frenzy, the usual quiet of Silver Pine replaced by frantic preparations. Alpha King Kalen, Cross of the Obsidian Crown, was beginning his decennial inspection of the Northern Territories. King Kalen was a legend whispered about in terrified, reverent tones. He was known as the ruthless sovereign who had single-handedly united the fractured wolf factions of the continent through sheer force of will and an unbending adherence to pack law. He was a traditionalist, a lethal warrior, and a ruler who possessed no tolerance for corruption or weakness. Dominic was terrified. His pack's finances were questionable. His border security had never truly recovered from the rogue attack 3 years prior, and he desperately desired a seat on the king's high council to secure his political future. To impress the king, Dominic had ordered the construction of a massive banquet hall, demanding an exorbitant feast that the pack could barely afford. For the past 3 weeks, Lyra had barely slept. She was forced to haul massive logs of oak from the forest for the grand hearths, polish the silver cutlery, a task that burned her skin, leaving her fingertips red and blistered, and scrub every inch of the estate until her knees bled. "You missed a spot, traitor." A heavy boot suddenly kicked the bucket of soapy water beside Lyra, sending the freezing liquid spilling over her already soaked jeans. Lyra flinched, instinctively pulling her hood tighter around her face. She looked at the polished leather boots standing before her. "Beta Gregory." "Clean it up," Gregory snapped, his voice a low, gravelly threat. "The king arrives at dusk. If there is a single speck of dirt in this courtyard, when his carriage pulls in, I will have the enforcers drag you through the gravel by your hair." "Yes, Beta Gregory," Lyra whispered, her voice hoarse from disuse. "And stay out of sight tonight," Gregory added, leaning down, his breath smelling of stale coffee and malice. "We don't need the Alpha King looking at your repulsive face and thinking we harbor diseased animals." Lyra swallowed the lump of humiliation, lodged in her throat, and reached for the sponge, soaking up the spilled water as Gregory's footsteps faded away. She prayed to the moon goddess that the king's visit would be brief. She just wanted to disappear into the shadows where she belonged. The grand hall of Silver Pine was an opulent display of desperation. Crystal chandeliers, borrowed from neighboring human estates, cast a warm, golden glow over long mahogany tables, groaning under the weight of roasted meats, exotic fruits, and imported wines. The pack elites were dressed in their finest silks and tailored suits, their faces painted with nervous, eager smiles. At the head table, seated on a high-backed chair, carved from dark walnut, was Alpha King Kalen Cross. He was a terrifyingly magnificent sight. Standing at 6'4", Kalen radiated an aura of absolute dominance that suffocated the room. His dark hair was swept back, revealing a chiseled jaw and piercing, storm-gray eyes that seemed to strip away the facades of everyone he looked at. He wore a tailored charcoal suit with a subtle, obsidian pin on his lapel, the crest of the royal family. Beside him stood his second-in-command, Beta Harrison, a stoic man who watched the room with the predatory stillness of a hawk. Dominic sat to the king's right, sweating profusely despite the cool mountain air drafting through the hall. Celine sat beside Dominic, draped in a deep emerald gown, trying far too hard to engage the king in light conversation. Kalen responded only with curt nods and silence, his sharp gaze dissecting the lavish display. He knew when a pack was bleeding itself dry for a show. He detested it. Deep in the kitchens, the heat was suffocating. Lyra stood in the corner, her hood pulled securely over her head, her lungs burning as she washed an endless mountain of grease-stained iron skillets. Her arms ached, and her legs trembled from 18 hours of uninterrupted labor. Suddenly, the kitchen doors swung open, and the head Omegas bustled in, panicked. "We need more wine in the hall. The king's glass is empty, and Dominic is glaring daggers at us." Before Lyra could step back into the shadows, a heavy hand grabbed her shoulder. It was Gregory. "You," he barked, shoving a massive, ornate silver tray into Lyra's hands. Resting on it was a heavy crystal decanter of dark red wine and 2 silver goblets. "Take this to the high table." Lyra's eyes widened beneath her hood. "Beta Gregory, please. You ordered me to stay out of sight. I'm not permitted in the grand hall." "I am ordering you now," Gregory sneered, a cruel glint in his eye. He leaned in closer. "Celine wants the king to see our pack's justice. She wants him to know how harshly Dominic punishes traitors. It shows strength. You will walk out there, serve the wine, and if you drop it, I will skin you alive." Trembling, Lyra gripped the silver tray. The metal immediately began to singe her palms, a low, buzzing burn that aggravated the ever-present ache in her scarred face. She bowed her head, ensuring her heavy gray hood completely veiled her features, and pushed through the swinging doors into the grand hall. The noise of the banquet hit her like a physical blow. Laughter, clinking glasses, and the heavy scent of roasted venison and expensive perfumes filled the air. Lyra kept her eyes glued to the floor, navigating through the narrow spaces between the tables. She felt the immediate shift in the room's atmosphere as the pack members noticed her. The laughter died down, replaced by harsh whispers and disgusted scoffs. "Look at the state of it. Why is that creature in here? Dominic is too soft. He should have killed her." Every whisper was a fresh cut, but Lyra moved steadily forward, her hands burning against the silver tray. She reached the dais, where the high table sat. She could feel the crushing weight of the Alpha King's aura pressing down on her shoulders. It was intoxicating and terrifying, a raw, primal power that made the dormant wolf inside her stir for the first time in 3 years. A strange, sharp scent hit her nose over the smell of the wine petrichor, sharp pine, and cold steel. She approached Dominic's side of the table first, keeping her head bowed low. She reached out with trembling hands to pour the wine. Celine, annoyed that the king was entirely ignoring her attempts at conversation, saw an opportunity to demonstrate her own authority. As Lyra stepped back to move toward the king's goblet, Celine subtly extended her velvet-clad foot. Lyra's worn boot caught on Celine's heel. Time seemed to slow down. Lyra stumbled forward, her exhausted legs unable to correct her balance. The heavy silver tray slipped from her burned hands. The crystal decanter shattered against the stone floor, sending a spray of dark red wine splashing across the polished leather of King Kaelin's boots and the hem of his trousers. A collective gasp echoed through the massive hall. Then, dead, horrifying silence. Dominic's face turned a violent shade of crimson. The vein in his forehead pulsed. He leaped from his chair, the heavy wood scraping loudly against the stone. "You clumsy, worthless wretch," Dominic roared. He didn't care about the king's presence anymore. All he saw was his political ambitions shattering alongside the crystal. He lunged forward, grabbing a fistful of Lyra's heavy woolen cloak near her collar, yanking her brutally to her knees amid the broken glass. Lyra let out a sharp, muted gasp of pain as a shard of crystal pierced her knee, but she kept her hands clamped over the edges of her hood, terrified it would fall back. "Forgive this vile creature." "Your Majesty," Dominic spat, shaking Lyra so violently her teeth rattled. He raised his free hand, preparing to strike her across the head. "She is a traitor to this pack, a murderer who sold our secrets. I keep her alive only to suffer, to show my people the price of betrayal. I will have her dealt with immediately." He brought his hand down. "Stop." The voice was not a shout. It was a low, resonant command that vibrated through the floorboards and settled heavily in the chests of every werewolf in the room. The sheer force of the Alpha command laced within that single word froze Dominic's arm mid-air. King Kaelin slowly stood up. He didn't look at the spilled wine on his boots. He didn't look at Dominic. His storm-gray eyes were locked entirely on the trembling, hooded figure on the floor. Since the moment the Omega had entered the room, Kaelin's wolf had been pacing frantically in his mind. He had traveled the continent for 10 years, searching for the other half of his soul, his fated mate. He had long abandoned hope, assuming she had died before they could meet. But when this broken, shivering woman had walked in, smelling of fear, ash, and old wounds, a faint, undeniable thread of gold had snapped into place in his chest. "Mate," his wolf growled, thrashing against his ribs. "Our mate is bleeding." Kaelin stepped around the table, his imposing figure towering over Dominic. "Release her." "Sire, you don't understand," Dominic stammered, his bravado evaporating under the king's lethal gaze. "She is a monster. Her face." "I said, release her, Alpha Dominic." Kaelin's voice dropped an octave, an implicit threat of violence that made the air in the room turn icy. Dominic instantly let go of Lyra's cloak, stepping back and bowing his head in submission. Lyra stayed on the floor, curled into herself, her breathing shallow and ragged. She waited for the king to order her execution. Spilling wine on the Alpha King was a death sentence for an Omega. Instead, a pair of large, impeccably clean hands reached down. They didn't grab her roughly. They gently, but firmly, grasped her arms and pulled her up from the broken glass. Lyra was forced to stand, though she kept her chin tucked tightly to her chest, the hood casting her face in deep shadow. She was trembling so violently, she thought her bones might shatter. "Look at me," Kalen commanded, the harshness completely gone from his voice, replaced by a strange, tight gentleness. Lyra shook her head frantically, a pathetic whimper escaping her lips. "Please," she croaked, her voice barely a whisper. "Please, don't look. I am marked." "Don't look at her, sire," Celine piped up from the table, desperate to regain control of the narrative. "She wears the hood because her face is a mangled nightmare, a testament to her betrayal, branded with silver and wolfsbane. She is offensive to the eyes." Kalen's jaw locked. A low, terrifying growl rumbled in his chest at the mention of silver and wolfsbane. He ignored Celine entirely. He took a step closer to Lyra, his chest almost brushing hers. The scent of petrichor and pine wrapped around her, calming the frantic, panicked beating of her heart in a way that made no logical sense. "I will be the judge of what is offensive," Kalen said softly, meant only for her ears. Slowly, deliberately, the Alpha King raised his hands. He bypassed her trembling arms and reached for the thick, coarse fabric of her hood. Lyra squeezed her eyes shut, a single tear escaping and tracking down the unmarred left side of her face. She braced herself for the inevitable gasp of disgust, for the recoil, for the revulsion she had seen 100 times before. Kalen caught the edges of the hood and gently pushed it back, letting the heavy gray fabric fall to her shoulders. The grand hall held its breath. The right side of Lyra's face was exposed to the brilliant chandelier light. The scar was horrific, a massive, raised, silver-pink burn that warped her cheekbone and twisted the right corner of her mouth downward. It was the brutal, undeniable mark of a traitor. Dominic smirked, waiting for the king to order her thrown in the dungeons. But Kalen didn't recoil. He didn't look away. His storm-gray eyes traced the jagged lines of the scar, not with disgust, but with a sudden, devastating realization. His eyes moved from the burn to her trembling lips, and finally to her wide, terrified, mismatched eyes, one hazel, one clouded slightly from the trauma of the burn. Kalen's breath hitched. He raised a hand, his thumb gently brushing away the tear on her unscarred cheek, his skin burning hot against hers. "My king?" Beta Harrison stepped forward, sensing the sudden, volatile shift in his monarch's aura. Kalen ignored him. He looked at Lyra, his voice carrying clearly across the dead silent hall. "Who did this to you, my queen?" The silence in the grand hall was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. The words "my queen" hung in the chilled air, like a suspended executioner's blade. Dominic's mouth opened and closed silently, resembling a landed fish gasping for oxygen. He looked from the king to the trembling, scarred Omega, kneeling amidst the broken glass and spilled wine. His mind, clouded by panic and arrogance, utterly failed to process the reality of the situation. "Sire," Dominic finally choked out, his voice cracking under the immense, crushing pressure of Kalen's leaking aura. The air in the room was growing thick, smelling sharply of an impending electrical storm. There must be some mistake. The bond must be confused by the wolfsbane in her scars. She is Lyra Hayes. She sold our patrol routes to rogues. She has the blood of 16 wolves on her hands. Kalen didn't even blink. He remained crouched before Lyra, his massive frame shielding her from the stares of the room. Slowly, he reached out, his large, warm hand cupping the unmarred left side of her jaw. As his skin made full contact with hers, a visible shudder ran through both of them. A golden, luminescent warmth flared in Lyra's chest, thawing the ice that had encased her dormant wolf for 3 agonizing years. Her wolf stretched, letting out a weak, desperate whimper of recognition within her mind. Mate. Safe. A mistake? Kalen's voice was dangerously quiet. He finally turned his head to look at Dominic. The storm gray of his eyes had bled into pitch black, the absolute manifestation of his alpha wolf taking the surface. You believe the moon goddess makes mistakes, Alpha Dominic? No, sire. But you branded my fated mate, Kalen interrupted, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. The crystal chandeliers above them began to tremble, the glass tinkling ominously as the sheer physical force of his rage radiated outward. You subjected the Queen of the Northern Territories to the labor of a slave, allowed your mate to trip her, and raised your hand to strike her in my presence. Celine let out a high-pitched squeak of terror and stumbled backward, hiding behind the heavy velvet drapes of the high table. Beta Gregory, ever the survivor, realized the catastrophic shift in power. He began to slowly, subtly, inch his way toward the secondary kitchen doors, hoping the king's focus was solely on Dominic. Beta Harrison, Kalen commanded, without looking away from Dominic. Yes, my king, Harrison replied instantly, his hand resting on the hilt of the silver blade strapped to his thigh. Seal the Grand Hall. Post guards at every exit of this territory. No one leaves Silver Pine Ridge. Anyone who attempts to cross the border is to be treated as a hostile rogue. At once. Harrison whistled sharply, a piercing sound that commanded the royal guard stationed outside. Within seconds, 12 heavily armed Obsidian elites poured into the hall, their faces stoic, their weapons drawn. The Silver Pine elites whimpered, dropping to their knees in immediate submission. Kalen turned his attention back to Lyra. She was hyperventilating, the adrenaline and shock finally overwhelming her malnourished, exhausted body. The pain in her bleeding knee, where the crystal had pierced her, throbbed in time with her racing heart. Lyra, Kalen whispered, the name rolling off his tongue like a sacred prayer. He ignored the gasps of the pack as he knelt fully into the puddle of spilled wine and broken glass, disregarding the ruin of his expensive suit. Look at me, sweetheart. Just look at me. Lyra forced her mismatched eyes upward. She expected pity. She expected the terrifying, possessive rage that most alphas displayed. But in Kalen's eyes, she saw only an ocean of profound grief and a desperate, terrifying tenderness. I didn't do it, she whispered, her voice breaking. It was the first time in 3 years she had defended herself. The pack had beaten the defiance out of her, but the presence of her mate drew the truth from her lips, like poison from a wound. I didn't betray them. I know, Kalen said fiercely, his thumb gently stroking her unscarred cheek. My wolf knows your soul, Lyra. A soul as pure as yours could never harbor such treachery. Who framed you? Before she could answer, the room began to spin. The exhaustion of 3 years of relentless torment, combined with the overwhelming surge of the mate bond, was too much for her fragile state. Her eyes rolled back, and she collapsed forward. Kalen caught her before she hit the stone floor. He gathered her into his arms, lifting her effortlessly against his chest. She weighed practically nothing, a fact that elicited a low, terrifying growl from deep within his chest. He stripped off his heavy, charcoal suit jacket and wrapped it securely around her shivering form, making sure the dark fabric shielded her scarred face from the prying, terrified eyes of her abusers. He stood up, holding his unconscious queen. He locked eyes with Beta Harrison. Arrest Alpha Dominic, Beta Gregory, and the pack physician, Kalen ordered, his voice echoing with absolute authority. Throw them in their own silver-lined isolation cells. We leave for the Obsidian Crown immediately. Bring the prisoners. As the royal guards surged forward to drag a screaming Dominic and a fiercely resisting Gregory away in heavy silver chains, Kalen carried Lyra out of the grand hall, leaving the shattered remains of the Silver Pine pack in his wake. Lyra woke to the smell of eucalyptus and rain. She didn't open her eyes immediately, terrified she would find herself back in the drafty, freezing Omega quarters, staring at a moldy ceiling. But the bed beneath her was impossibly soft, the linen smelling of expensive lavender detergent rather than damp earth. You're safe. The voice was a deep, resonant rumble. Lyra's eyes snapped open. She was in a massive bedroom, bathed in the soft golden light of late afternoon. High arched windows overlooked a sprawling, mountainous landscape that was decidedly not Silver Pine. Seated in a velvet armchair beside the bed was Kalen, He had discarded his formal wear, dressed now in a simple black sweater and dark jeans, looking simultaneously relaxed and incredibly dangerous. Lyra instinctively brought a hand to her face, her fingers brushing the jagged edges of her scar. She tried to turn her head into the pillow to hide it. "Don't," Kalen said softly, leaning forward. He gently caught her wrist, pulling her hand away from her face. "You never have to hide from me, Lyra. Never." "It's hideous," she whispered, a tear slipping down her cheek. "I am broken. An Alpha King cannot have a deformed mate. The Council, the other packs. The Council will bow to their queen, or I will replace them," Kalen stated with chilling nonchalance. "And the other packs will look upon you with respect, or they will answer to my armies. Your scar is not a deformity, Lyra. It is a testament that you survived monsters. But I swear to you, on the moon goddess herself, the monsters will not survive me." Over the next 2 weeks, Lyra remained within the protective walls of the Obsidian Crown Palace. Dr. Thomas Sterling, the king's brilliant and fiercely loyal private physician, was assigned to her care. Dr. Sterling was a kind, older man who treated her burn with advanced salves that soothed the perpetual ache of the wolfsbane residue. He fed her rich, nutrient-dense meals to rebuild her strength and patiently guided her dormant wolf back to the surface. For the first time in years, Lyra felt the comforting, powerful presence of her inner wolf, a silver-furred guardian who immediately basked in the warmth of Kalen's affection. Kalen was a constant, steady presence. He didn't push her. He spent his evenings sitting with her by the fire, reading to her, or simply holding her hand, letting the mate bond naturally weave them together, healing the shattered fragments of her trust. But while Kalen was gentle with Lyra, his wrath outside her chambers was dismantling the North. On the 15th day, Kalen entered Lyra's private sitting room, accompanied by Commander Reese, the head of Royal Intelligence. Reese bowed deeply to Lyra, before placing a thick, leather-bound dossier on the mahogany table. "We have the truth, my queen," Reese said, his voice respectful and grave. Lyra sat up straighter, pulling her silk shawl tightly around her shoulders. Kalen came to stand behind her, resting his large hands reassuringly on her shoulders. The heat of his touch gave her the courage to nod. "Tell me." Reese opened the dossier, revealing copies of bank ledgers, coded letters, and a transcribed confession. The rogue attack 3 years ago was not a random breach. It was a coordinated strike funded by the Blood Moon faction, a rival group seeking to destabilize King Kalen's control over the northern territories. But they needed an inside man to lower the eastern perimeter wards. Beta Gregory, Lyra guessed, her stomach churning at the memory of the cruel man. Gregory was the orchestrator. Yes, Reese confirmed. He was embezzling pack funds for years, and the Blood Moon faction promised him a vast fortune and the alpha title of Silver Pine once Dominic was disgraced. But Gregory didn't have access to the patrol clearance codes. Only the lead tracker and the head of pack enforcement had those. Lyra froze. Her blood ran cold as a horrifying realization dawned on her. The head of pack enforcement. Liam, she breathed, the name tasting like ash on her tongue. Kalen's grip on her shoulders tightened slightly, an anchor in the sudden storm of her memories. "Yes," Reese said grimly. Liam had amassed massive gambling debts in the human underground. The rogues bought his debt. In exchange, Liam provided the exact coordinates and times of your patrols. When the attack happened, and Dominic demanded a scapegoat, Gregory realized you were already investigating the missing pack funds. You were too dangerous to keep around. Gregory blackmailed Liam. Help frame Lyra, or Gregory would expose Liam's treason to Dominic. Lyra closed her eyes, a wave of profound nausea washing over her. The man she had loved, the man she had planned to marry, hadn't just abandoned her after she was scarred. He had handed her the knife that ruined her life. He had forged her signature, planted the wolf's bane in her room with Dr. Blackwood's help, and stood by in the town square, watching in silence as she was dragged to the fountain and branded for his crimes. Dr. Blackwood confessed, under interrogation, Reese continued. He admitted to forging the wolfsbane evidence, and to ensuring the branding iron was laced with it, to permanently damage your wolf. Gregory has also broken. Liam was arrested this morning in his home. His new mate tried to run, but she was detained. Silence fell over the room. Lyra stared at the roaring fire in the hearth, processing the sheer depth of the betrayal. It wasn't just blind, tragic injustice. It was a calculated, malicious destruction of her life by the people she trusted most. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice surprisingly steady. Kalen stepped around the chair, kneeling in front of her. He took both of her hands in his. "Now, my queen, we hold a royal tribunal. The entire continent will watch. The truth will be dragged into the light, and you will decide their fate." The grand amphitheater of the Obsidian Crown was a marvel of ancient werewolf architecture, carved directly into the dark granite of the mountain. It held thousands, and today every seat was filled. Alphas, betas, and emissaries from every pack in the continent had been summoned by royal decree. In the center of the massive stone floor, chained to heavy iron rings, were the architects of Lyra's torment: Alpha Dominic, Beta Gregory, Dr. Eris Blackwood, and Liam. They looked pathetic, stripped of their fine clothes, wearing the coarse, gray, burlap tunics of prisoners. The very same color of the hood Lyra had been forced to wear for 3 years. Liam was weeping silently, his face pale and drawn. Gregory glared at the stone floor, his ambition finally crushed under the weight of his own hubris. Dominic looked like a broken man, realizing he was about to lose everything because of his own blind incompetence. The heavy war horns blew, vibrating through the granite. The crowd rose to their feet in absolute silence as King Kalen emerged onto the high balcony, overlooking the amphitheater. He wore his formal armor, a terrifying ensemble of dark leather and silver accents, the obsidian crown resting upon his brow. But all eyes were on the woman who walked beside him. Lyra Hayes did not wear a hood. She wore a gown of midnight blue silk that flowed around her like liquid night, embroidered with silver thread that mirrored the night sky. Her dark hair was swept up and pinned back entirely, intentionally exposing the entirety of her face. The jagged, silver-pink burn that stretched across her right cheek and jaw was stark under the bright morning sun. A murmur rippled through the crowd, shock, pity, and awe. But as Lyra stood at the edge of the balcony, looking down at the men who had destroyed her, she didn't shrink. She didn't hide. She lifted her chin, her mismatched eyes burning with a quiet, terrifying strength. The dormant power of the lead tracker she used to be had fused with the immense authority of the Alpha Queen. Commander Reese stepped forward, his magically amplified voice booming across the amphitheater. He meticulously laid out the evidence. He read the bank ledgers, the forged patrol logs, and played the recorded confessions of Gregory and Dr. Blackwood. With every word, the crowd's murmurs turned into growls of absolute outrage. To frame an innocent pack member was a crime. To frame a fated royal mate with a Wolfsbane brand was an abomination against the moon goddess herself. When Reese finished, Kalen stepped to the edge of the balcony. He looked down at the prisoners, his eyes devoid of mercy. "Dominic Reed," Kalen's voice thundered, "you failed your pack. You allowed corruption to rot your ranks, and you condemned an innocent woman to torture simply to save face. You are hereby stripped of your alpha title, your territory, and your rank. You will live the rest of your days as an exile in the Deadlands." Dominic collapsed forward, sobbing against his chains. Kalen turned to Lyra. "The remaining 3 committed direct, malicious treason against you, my queen. Their judgment is yours to pass." Lyra stepped forward, her hands resting on the cold stone balustrade. She looked down at Liam. He looked up at her, tears streaming down his face. "Lyra, please," Liam begged, his voice cracking, pathetic in the vast arena. "I was scared. They were going to kill me. I'm so sorry. Remember what we had. Please, show mercy." Lyra stared at him, feeling absolutely nothing for the man she once thought she loved. The fire in her face, the scar that throbbed every time the weather turned cold, was his legacy. "You did not show mercy when they dragged me to the fountain." Lyra's voice was calm, but it carried effortlessly, amplified by the amphitheater's acoustics. You did not show mercy when I scrubbed the stones you walked on. You traded my life for your debts." She shifted her gaze to Gregory and Dr. Blackwood. "You sought power through blood," she declared. "You poisoned a branding iron to permanently maim my wolf, hoping I would die in the shadows so your secrets could live in the light. But I didn't die." Lyra placed her hand over her heart, feeling the steady, powerful rhythm of her mate bond with Kaelin. "By the power vested in me as Queen of the Obsidian Crown," Lyra proclaimed, her voice ringing with finality, "I sentence Beta Gregory, Dr. Eris Blackwood, and Liam to the maximum security deep vein silver mines of the Northern Crags. You will spend the rest of your natural lives digging the very metal you used to brand me. Furthermore, you are stripped of your wolves. You will serve your time as the mortals you act like." A collective gasp echoed through the crowd. To be stripped of one's wolf, achieved through a complex, agonizing ritual performed by royal warlocks, was the most severe punishment in their world. It was a living death. "No, no, please," Gregory screamed, thrashing against his chains as the royal guards descended upon the arena floor to drag them away. Liam just went entirely limp, dragging on the stone floor as he was hauled toward the darkest corner of the territory. Lyra watched them go, her posture rigid, until the heavy iron doors closed behind them. The oppressive weight that she had carried on her shoulders for 3 years finally lifted, dissolving into the crisp mountain air. The nightmare was over. She felt Kaelin step up behind her. He wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her back against his solid chest. He turned her around to face him, ignoring the thousands of eyes watching them. He reached up, his fingers gently tracing the jagged edge of her scar. He leaned down and pressed a soft, lingering kiss directly onto the burned flesh. The crowd erupted into a deafening roar of approval, the howling of thousands of wolves acknowledging their queen. Lyra smiled, a genuine, radiant expression that transformed her face, scar, and all. She was no longer the broken Omega in the gray hood. She was the survivor who had walked through the fire. And she was exactly where she belonged. Lyra Hayes never erased the jagged silver burn that scarred her right face. Instead, it became the defining crest of the Obsidian Queen. Beside King Kaelin, she ruled with a fierce, unyielding justice, serving as a living testament that true power doesn't lie in pristine perfection, but in the ultimate courage to survive the fire and forge a royal crown from the ashes. Her reign became a legend whispered forever.